Hello, everybody. So, last episode was a little bit different than the rest of my videos that I've posted so far. And if you have not seen it yet, then I highly recommend that you go and watch it, either before or after you watch this video, because it's about a vision that I had from God, and I've never had one before, and it was really cool, so I highly suggest that you go and watch that. But before that video, we left off in Ezra chapter 3, and the last video was about the Festival of Shelters, and we were talking about how they were rebuilding the temple of God in Jerusalem, and it ended when they built the foundation, they completed the foundation of God, and everyone began to praise the Lord with musical instruments and singing, and it was a big praise fest, and it was wonderful. And today we're going to be reading chapter 4. So let's get started. All right, chapter 4, verse 1 says, "The enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were rebuilding a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel. So they approached Zerubbabel and the other leaders and said, 'Let us build with you, for we worship your God just as you do. We have sacrificed to him ever since King Esarhaddon of Assyria brought us here.'" So just a little heads up, these people don't exactly worship God. They're most likely Samaritans, and so what I wrote down was I did some research, and they practice syncretism, which means you worship God and your own idols. I don't really know how that works, but apparently you're worshiping more than one God at once, because you're worshiping an actual God and you're worshiping your own idols. Really dumb idea. Don't recommend. But anyways, let's continue. So, verse 3 says, "But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the other leaders of Israel replied, 'You may have no part in this work. We alone will build the temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, just as King Cyrus of Persia commanded us.'" So, they're like, "No, you're not helping us build, because we know that you worship your own idols. You don't just worship God like we do. You're not a Jew." That's what they're saying, basically. You're not one of us. And he goes on to say in verse 4, "Then the local residents, the weird people who worship God and idols, tried to discourage and frighten the people of Judah to keep them from their work. They bribed agents to work against them and to frustrate their plans. This went on during the entire reign of King Cyrus of Persia and lasted until King Darius of Persia took the throne." Alright, so right now we're still in the time of King Cyrus, and these people came over and they bribed these agents and were like, frustrate their plans. So that we had to halt the building of the temple during King Cyrus's reign, all the way to King Darius. So we can kind of assume that King Darius is going to allow us to build again, or allow them to keep rebuilding the temple. All right. So this is a little summary I wrote over it. It says, "Enemies of Judah heard about the rebuilding and asked to help. Jews said no. Cyrus said, 'Only we can build it.' Enemies got mad and started discouraging everyone. They bribed agents to frustrate their plans. It was like this until King Darius took over." So that was that. And then, so this was during the reign of King Darius, but this next part that I'm about to read kind of fast forwards in time, and then at the end of the chapter, it goes back to the present time. So remember that while I'm reading this next paragraph. And it starts in verse 6. It's titled "Later Opposition Under Xerxes and Artaxerxes." So verse 6 says, "Years later, when Xerxes began his reign, the enemies of Judah wrote a letter of accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem." So these enemies are writing letters to Xerxes, who Xerxes is the son of Darius. So we skipped all of Darius because we fast forward in time to Xerxes, and they're saying years later, when Xerxes began his reign, the enemies of Judah wrote this letter of accusation against the people of Judah in Jerusalem, which Jerusalem is the capital of Judah. And then it goes on to say, even later, during the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia, who is the son of Xerxes, the enemies of Judah, led by Bishlam, Mithridath, and Tabeel, sent a letter to Artaxerxes in the Aramaic language, and it was translated for the king. So they're writing letters to both Xerxes while he was king and Artaxerxes while he was king about how bad Jerusalem is. And it goes on to say that Rehum the governor and Shimshai the court secretary wrote the letter. All right. So the enemies of Judah wrote a false letter to Artaxerxes about the Jews. This is what this next part's about. So this letter that they're writing is not really true at all. They're just trying to pretty much manipulate the king. Anyway, so if we go down to verse 12, it says, the king should know that the Jews who came here to Jerusalem from Babylon are rebuilding this rebellious and evil city. As you can see, they are writing about the city, no longer the temple. So the first paragraph with King Darius is about the temple. Now that we fast forwarded in time, it's about the city. They are just mad about them rebuilding the city. Verse 13 says, and the king should know that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, it will be much to your disadvantage, for the Jews will then refuse to pay their tribute, customs, and tolls to you. That's not true at all. They're just saying this because they're mad. Yeah. Verse 15 says, we suggest that a search be made in your ancestors' records. So they're telling Artaxerxes, hey, we want you to look through your files, basically, and see how bad these Jews used to be, so that we can stop them from building their city back up. Which is so stupid. Anyways, then it continues to say, in fact, it was destroyed because of its long and troublesome history of revolt against the kings and countries who controlled it. Yes, but that's also not exactly true, because in 2 Chronicles 36, verses 13 and 14, we learn that God was really angry at them because they had been practicing like paganism and stuff. Is bad. See right here, 2 Chronicles 36, verse 14. Likewise, all the leaders of the priest and the people became more and more unfaithful. They followed all the pagan practices of the surrounding nations, desecrating the temple of the Lord that had been consecrated in Jerusalem. So, yeah. And then if we go down to verse 17, it says, so the Lord brought the king of Babylon against them. The Babylonians killed Judah's young men, even chasing after them into the temple. So, it wasn't just about them not following the king's orders. It was about them being unfaithful to God, which is a bad idea. That wasn't smart either. So they should have been better at that time. But anyways, then King Artaxerxes replies. So he sends a letter back. And he says in verse 19, I ordered a search of the records and have found that Jerusalem has indeed been a hotbed of insurrection against many kings. In fact, rebellion and revolt are normal there. So he's saying that rebellion and revolt are normal in Jerusalem. Hasn't always been true. He just looked at some of the records, and yes, at a certain time and point it was true, but it hasn't always been like that. Now verse 21 says, therefore, issue orders to have these men stop their work. That city must not be rebuilt except at my express command. And now he's telling them to go stop them, and yeah, they're going to stop building the city. Let's see, verse 23 says, when this letter from King Artaxerxes was read, they hurried to Jerusalem. They forced the Jews to stop building. Yeah, they had to stop building, which sucks. But then guess what? It goes back to the present time, because remember this was fast forward. And so verse 24 then says, it's titled, The Rebuilding Resumes. Verse 24 says, so the work on the temple of God in Jerusalem had stopped. and it remained at a standstill until the 2nd year of the reign of King Darius of Persia. So, what happened was, we began with the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that they were rebuilding the temple when King Cyrus was in reign, and they pretty much paid agents to stop the rebuilding of the temple, in which they did. And so they couldn't rebuild the temple even up until King Darius became king. And then in King Darius' 2nd year of being king, he's like, all right, I can keep rebuilding this temple, get back at it. But then during the middle of all this was when it fast forwarded into time. So Artaxerxes is King Darius's grandson. And so the enemies of Judah were like, hey, don't let them rebuild the city because it was once bad, which was not exactly true. It was just bad for at one point. It wasn't always bad, but it hasn't always been a bad city. And they seem to be doing good again, but the enemies were upset and they're like, no, don't let them build this. So they did something called political manipulation. And so they manipulated King Artaxerxes, and he's not exactly a bad guy. He didn't know all the facts. So he was like, all right, shut him down. All right, so to sum it up, basically all the Jews have a bunch of enemies that do not want them to rebuild the city and rebuild the temple of God, because they're a bunch of haters. But yeah, that was chapter 4. I will continue with chapter 5 in the next video. I hope y'all have a good night. Peace.